Good morning and welcome to WITA for our special event today with Congressman Earl Blumenauer. This is our 34th regular webinar since March, and we just completed our 13-part intensive trade seminar yesterday with over 285 participants from 23 different countries. Tomorrow we're hosting a special event at 11 a.m., the first event in our 4-part Trade and the Environment series. And we hope that you guys will join us. If you are on this Zoom and you received your program today, at the bottom of that should have the link for you to join for tomorrow's event. That event will be free for WITA members. Now, as we get started with today's event, one of the traditions we have is to call out a few of the people you're in community with at today's event. So we'd like to welcome Emily Follett with the Embassy of Australia, David Skillman with Arnold and Porter, Steve Lamar with the American Apparel and Footwear Association, and Virginia Houston with the American Soybean Association. Welcome, Emily, David, Steve, and Virginia. Delighted to welcome all of you as well. Special welcome to our guest, Congressman Earl Blumenauer and Dr. Orit Frankel, the American Leadership Initiative. This is our 6th congressional interview we have hosted with ALI, and we're delighted to welcome you back, Orit, along with the chairman, who we've hosted many times at WITA in the past, but always live and in person. Thanks so much for joining us today on the WITA webinar platform to discuss your trade agenda for the rest of 2020 and into 2021, Congressman. After the Congressman and Orit have their discussion, we'll try to get to as many audience questions as we can. So please use the Q&A tab on Zoom to submit your questions. Orit?
Thank you, Ken and Diego and WITA, for your partnership on these events. The American Leadership Initiative, or ALI, is creating a new vision and agenda for restoring American global leadership, working with elected officials, their staff, and a diverse group of thought leaders, including business and civil society. You can learn more about us by going to our website, which is american-leadership.org. Thank you, Congressman Blumenauer, for taking time out of your what I know is an incredibly busy schedule to chat with us today. You've been a good friend at ALI, which I appreciate, and these interviews have been a really great way of connecting with members since, unfortunately, we can't meet in person these days. Congressman Blumenauer has been representing Portland, Oregon in Congress since 1996. Prior to his election, he spent 20 years in local government. So he's really dedicated his entire career to public service, for which we are ever so grateful. He is now chair of the House Ways and Means Trade Subcommittee. So you've been a strong advocate of making the benefits of trade more inclusive. You've led the effort to ensure that USMCA had tough language on labor and the environment. And earlier this week, in fact, your committee held a hearing regarding products imported into the US using forced labor from Xinjiang. You've also expressed a lot of frustration at the administration's application of tariffs on many of our close allies. Our failure to appoint appellate judges to the WTO, which has dismantled the dispute settlement system, and our rapidly deteriorating relationship with China. So your committee is going to have a lot on their plate this upcoming year. And so looking forward to this conversation. So over the next year, your committee will be faced with the expiration of TPA, TAA, and GSP, not to mention kind of a whole myriad of other trade issues. How do you see your committee's priorities for 2021?
Well, first of all, let me say, Art, how much I appreciate the opportunity to join with you. I'm sorry it took so long for us to schedule this, to get your opportunities in mind. Although
you're a busy man, which we appreciate.
Well, the upside is the passage of time makes all of these issues, I think, much clearer. Or seriously, you've already heard from some of my most capable and knowledgeable colleagues. And I appreciate sharing the program with someone as knowledgeable and accomplished as Dr. Frankel. I note that you worked with my dear friend Lee Hamilton when he was chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, speaking to a different era.
For sure.
Human being. Well, let me just say, prior to assuming the chairmanship, I made commitments to my colleagues that I would be working to find ways to use the committee as a platform to bring people together rather than dividing them. I continue to be committed over the course of the next Congress to find ways to bring people together, to focus on solving recognized problems and build on the understanding and the coalition that we had in the last Congress. With the updated NAFTA, we were able to deliver on that pledge. It took a lot of extra time and energy, but I think it was worth it. The overwhelming vote for it and the fact that we inherited a trade agreement that wasn't going anywhere, and we got broad bipartisan support. I want to build on that work that we've done. It's important that people understand that we're serious about our trade agreement, that we're going to enforce them. And as you mentioned, or I am absolutely committed to re-engaging with allies, friends, countries around the world. It's important to fix the damage that the Trump administration has wrought. And I think the Trade Subcommittee can be an important part of that effort, and not dismissing countries as S-hole countries or just being so belligerent.
Thank you. So I think, as you know, even though trade agreements are overall of great benefit to the economy, there are always individual workers, facilities, communities who suffer losses. Trade adjustment assistance has always been a way, has always accompanied trade legislation as a way of compensating those workers. TAA is expiring over the summer. And given sort of since the last TAA, we've seen really broad shifts in the economy with workers, increasingly losing jobs due to technology, automation, and shifts in the economy in addition to trade. Is it time to rethink how we compensate workers who lose their job for, whatever reason?
Well, and that, I think, is a critical point, or for whatever reason. You talked about the trends that are taking place, that in a world that's upset by COVID, the politics are strange, there's natural disasters. We're watching the collapse of the retail sector, and we don't know exactly where we're going to go when we come out of this. I've long been interested in the German model that looks holistically at helping workers, regardless of the stresses that they face. We just spend relatively little on active labor market adjustment programs. And it's not clear how broad the support will be this next year. I would think the COVID backdrop and the economic upset ought to encourage more people to be involved. I think we have a duty to blunt the damage that has been done to workers and their families. And ultimately, it's in the national interest to help any worker displaced by larger economic forces. And I hope that we can continue to welcome ideas to empower workers to adjust in a job that doesn't weaken an already inadequate TAA. It would be beneficial not only for workers, but for companies that are going to be facing stresses in trying to maintain a workforce. And I think this would be a great point of departure for a broader conversation that we need for our economy. Well, enough said.
Yeah, thank you. Totally support the fact that we need some kind of broader adjustment assistance. So thank you for thinking in that direction. So just continuing on labor for a minute, I know you and other committee members have expressed some frustration regarding how the Mexican government and their lack of enforcement around the USMCA labor provisions. What recourse does the U.S. have, to seek compliance? And, what does this teach us for future agreements on how we can have better compliance on labor enforcement, particularly, in agreements with low or middle income countries?
Well, compliance is critical to gain support for trade agreements.
Right.
Our work in this area with our friends in organized labor, the business community, was key to being able to get the broad support that we had for the updated NAFTA. We have the first of its kind factory-specific labor enforcement mechanism, and I expect the mechanism will be used and people who cross the line will be sanctioned. There's also a state-to-state mechanism, which the House Democrats were able to strengthen when we negotiated NAFTA 2.0. The state-to-state mechanism they gave us was completely unworkable. We were able to change that. COVID-19 was not part of the equation when we renegotiated NAFTA, and our expectations on timing will probably need to be adjusted. However, the expectation regarding resolve and commitment of America and the Mexican government are not changing. Real investment of time, effort, and diligence are required now more than ever. We need to make sure that that updated NAFTA delivers successful outcomes. That was the whole point of our effort, and that's the key to getting the overwhelming bipartisan support, particularly with some Democrats that none of you can remember ever voting for a trade agreement.
Right, absolutely.
And they did so enthusiastically because it would be worth the paper it was printed on.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, the language, certainly the labor language was a huge, huge step forward, and getting the labor community to support it, was just a complete paradigm shift. So hopefully we can work with Mexico to get that on the right track.
That is our imperative at this point.
So Trade Promotion Authority, as you know, is also expiring this year. I'm sure your committee is considering, updating how to update the negotiating objectives. So how is the next TPA going to be different? And what kind of new negotiating objectives are you thinking about?
Well, as you know, I have a long history of rejecting Trade Promotion Authority that was narrow and partisan with both parties. It relies on cooperation between any administration and Congress, and indeed it will, if done properly, it lays out a roadmap. Sadly, the Trump administration has unilaterally, without allies and Congress, acted and abused, I think, the authority that was delegated to it by Congress. There must be a clear understanding of how delegated powers will be used and how the next administration plans to engage Congress, and TPA gives us that framework. I imagine the content and timing will depend on who the president is and how well he engages Congress. But regardless, Congress must stand firm. If we see the same high-handed approach, whoever's in power in 2021, I will be leading efforts to radically rethink Congress's traditional delegation of trade authority to the executive. If we have an administration that commits sincerely to restoring the partnership with Congress on trade, I expect we will have many members who will still want to revisit some of the parameters of congressional delegation, but they'll be pleased to see a cooperative and respectful partner on trade, and will make all of this much easier to negotiate.
Well, that sounds encouraging. So, digital, one of your new negotiating objectives, I hope, includes something on digital technologies, which are, obviously an increasingly large part of our economy. And, COVID has certainly brought that into much sharper focus. And so digital trade issues have really moved to the center of our trade agenda. I know the US is involved in the WTO negotiations on e-commerce, but I worry that those results will be relatively low ambition, because they include China and other countries that don't share our vision of the internet as one that is open, democratic, et cetera. So, I know ALI, we've written about negotiating an agreement outside the WTO, which would be high standard and basically include a coalition of countries willing to negotiate new standards that are based more on American trade, American values. Would you support such an initiative?
Well, I'm very interested in exploring that with you, but whether it's within the confines of WTO or outside, you're right. This has moved to the center, and it has broad implications for how we live, particularly in a post-COVID era. One of the concerns I have is that the administration is seeking and obtaining digital agreements without involving Congress. We saw that outcome with Japan, and I think it was delicately suboptimal. In the multilateral agreements context, it's even more critical that the USTR is in lockstep with Congress. We don't need artificial conflicts. It's only by working together can we stand strong against China or any other nation that might be pulling the outcome of negotiations to the lowest common denominator. And that simply is not worth the effort.
Well, I hope we will get an administration that will be willing to work in lockstep with Congress in that way. So you've also been a very ardent supporter of including environmental provisions in trade negotiations. You were instrumental, I think, in getting some of the logging provisions into the Peru agreement, 10 years ago. So one of the things that ALI has really talked about is going back to the environmental goods agreement, which really was to eliminate tariffs on trade in environmental goods. And that kind of came to an abrupt halt after the 2016 election. I personally think that there's great opportunity to even expand that a little broader to include environmental services and other kinds of things, and really make that a win-win for the economy, the economy, U.S. industry, as well as obviously the planet. Is that something that your committee could be interested in?
Well, trust me, climate change is a global emergency. I'm living it as my state is on fire. The horrific events in Australia earlier in the year and that are continuing on the West Coast illustrate the need for a broad, inclusive agenda that just must be addressed sustainably. Part of that sustainability will be improving labor standards, protecting the environment as we produce environmental goods and facilitate their exchange, basic IP rights to drive innovation, and to promote environmental justice. I am quite confident that if we have a President Biden, he will recommit to the United States re-engaging the Paris Climate Accords. One of the many frustrations we had in terms of trying to, that made the work on updating NAFTA so tedious was the administration's absolute refusal to have any even hint of dealing with climate. And we made some significant environmental protections, but it ignored the disaster that's staring us in the face. We cannot solve this global climate challenge on our own, and working with like-minded allies, friends, and partners I think there's an opportunity for real progress, and I want to make that an important part of our trade committee's agenda.
Thank you. Certainly hope that progress is made in that direction. I know you and the state of Oregon are really struggling mightily at this point. So, the other big trade issue, of course, that we haven't discussed yet is China. And you know that the administration has engaged in a tit for tat tariff escalation with China. And we're now in a situation of badly strained bilateral relationships, and there have been huge costs on domestic workers, factories, farmers, et cetera. And yet, many of the fundamental trade issues with China that the administration did identify are legitimate and very much still with us, whether it's subsidies, to their state-owned enterprises, whether it's forced tech transfer, et cetera. And obviously separately, we see China engaged in other types of bad behaviors, whether it's Xinjiang, Hong Kong. So how do we really change our approach to China in a way where, we can make progress? We're not on the brink of a Cold War, but yet, obviously we have to take these realities into account.
I don't know what we're on the brink of with China, but I do know that this administration's policies have been an unmitigated disaster. His fixation on reducing a trade deficit, which is overblown, as you know, but if that's the metric, he failed miserably as the trade deficit has exploded. There are a wide array of areas, from labor standards, environmental protection, human rights. These are all trade issues, and they've neither been identified or addressed by this administration. Perhaps the biggest failure is just simply a lack of strategic vision. Drive-by tariffs and bluster, especially when it comes to China, is a horrific mistake. The second failure, I think, with China, absent strategic vision, is the failure to work with Congress and allies to hold China accountable. There is broad consensus with things that we care about in terms of managing the distortion of their state-owned enterprises, for instance. Their bad behavior dealing with technology. There is broad agreement, and our friends and allies would join with us and be a full force multiplier. It's these non-market practices not only put us at a competitive disadvantage, it undermines our global trading system. And I want us to engage, particularly with the private sector. You referenced the hearings we had about the horrific treatment of the Uyghurs. It's a very complex situation. Supply chains are elaborate, to say the very least, but we have to be committed to tackling it, and as difficult as it is, working with the private sector and our allies to address it. COVID-19 has exposed shortcomings in our supply chain. It showed how brittle the supply chain with food is, forcing us to pour hundreds of thousands of gallons on the ground, or slaughter animals that where the production mechanism got out kilter. How vulnerable a supply system is that depends on just-in-time performance. Inadequate PPE and medical supply. These are areas that we are going to have to address, I think, aggressively, but it is an area where the global community will be, I think, ready to work with us, and we can't simply solve them on our own.
Well, Yes, I totally agree and look forward to your leadership in that direction. So continuing with China, there are, as you know, very valid national security issues that the administration has identified and that I think all of us are struggling with how to deal with. So, the administration has imposed restrictions on Huawei and ZTE on their ability to sell products in the United States and barring their suppliers from using American technology and software. Recently we've of course seen the threat to ban TikTok. And so I think we all agree that we need strong measures to safeguard our technology. And I think we're all struggling with how to impose these restrictions while, I think acknowledging that a complete decoupling is really not in our interest. And so how do we manage that very, very tricky tightrope?
Well, it is complex. It is a wide variety of interrelated issues, which makes it so interesting and important. But in managing the technology risks with China, yes, take them seriously. But here again, we need to have a rational and coherent approach. I'm very concerned about the politicization of these policies that the administration is engaged in. Huawei strikes me as presenting far-reaching and concerning risks, but the risks for TikTok seem to me on a different level and scale. Their recent moves on TikTok and WeChat, I question why they're being done through executive order, another tool for avoiding the important work of making the case to and partnering with Congress to be able to refine what they're doing and help making it stick. I question why they've become such a priority given other challenges that we have with China. I believe that there are other technological challenges that merit the attention and focus that's currently being spent on TikTok and WeChat, like the attacks on American technology, whether forced transfer or outright theft. The problem with the Trump administration's China policy is it's not that they're not too tough. It's tough may often be very appropriate. We should not shy away from being tough. The problem with the Trump administration's China trade policies in particular is they seem arbitrary, punitive, and too often incoherent. They confuse our allies and confound our adversaries. These characteristics undermine the confidence that measures will need to be effective to actually serve long-term American interests as opposed to some political actors' immediate desire.
So I know that there's a whole spate of legislation in Congress, a number of bills introduced by, I think, Ron Kind, Susan DelBene, and others to kind of claw back some of the power from the president and bring it back to Congress. How do you think about that legislation? Do you think it has a chance of passing? Is it aimed at a particular president, or is it kind of a longer standing issue where we need to really rebalance the power on trade?
Well, having worked with Ron since I first went on the committee, Susan DelBene is a very thoughtful member. I think they raise profound questions and have some good alternatives. We will work with them in greater detail. I think they can help set the stage. They are vital members of the Trade Subcommittee, and I look forward to helping spotlight some of their important work in the past. They are two of the foremost experts in Congress on any committee, and it provides us with a valuable resource.
Well, I see we have some questions lining up, so I'm just going to close with one last question, which I've been recently asking every member, which is if you were advising the Biden campaign, and maybe you are, what types of new policies and directions would you urge them to take in January?
Well, first of all, let me suggest that what I think a President Biden would do is not necessarily a new policy. It's just working with Congress, working with allies, looking at the big picture. I imagine that will be the focus of the new administration. Vice President Biden, in his years in the Senate and his work as vice president, demonstrated an understanding, a commitment, and an ability to follow through. I think we have a critical opportunity to deal with some of our domestic trade woes. We supported the revised NAFTA because of new enforcement tools. The next administration must work to fully enforce that agreement and enforce old agreements. It would do a great deal to heal the skepticism around trade, which at heart is a domestic issue. I also think the vice president instinctively understands the role of infrastructure. He hasn't just talked about it. He led the charge during the American Recovery Act and saw firsthand its impact, and I think saw the problems because we actually, despite the protests that we were spending too much money, I think all independent observers have concluded that we didn't spend enough and we didn't do it long enough. And I think being able to align trade policy with infrastructure, I think forms the foundation for a new industrial policy, which is long overdue.
Thank you very much for your thoughts. I'm going to turn it over to Ken because I see we have a lot of good questions that have lined up.
Yes, we do. We do have a number of questions popping up. And I'm going to start with some that kind of follow up on some of the themes you were just discussing a second ago. So questions relate to China, and the questions relate to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Of course, as you know, the Trans-Pacific Partnership was not only a trade agreement between the United States and several of our Pacific Rim allies and neighbors. It was also a chance to create a new template that we would hope that someday China might aspire to, but if they didn't, it would create a ring of trade agreements around China that would position the US at the center of those relationships. Of course, we didn't conclude the TPP, we weren't able to ratify it, but how do you see us working with our allies, and this is where several of the questions come in, to confront China, the issues related to China that we have discussed already. Canada recently backed out of trying to reach a trade deal itself with China. Are these opportunities for us to work with our allies, even whether it's with the new CPT Congress, the Comprehensive Progressive Trade Partnership that was done without the United States, or some other ways to work with our allies?
Well, I felt that withdrawing from the efforts to try and refine the TPP was a mistake. It never reached the point where I was comfortable supporting it, but until the dying days of the Obama administration, I was working on things to be able to make it more acceptable, more enforceable, and deal with the many complaints I heard. It's the same approach we took with the renewed NAFTA 2.0. It absolutely makes sense for the United States to work with those countries to be able to define the rules of the road in the Pacific region and beyond. And we've watched China move to step in and fill the void, and they have no commitment to our values whatsoever. There is a hunger for partnership with the United States if it's done in a thoughtful fashion. And we ought to pick up where we left off, be able to deal with problems that people had. But in the final analysis, there's so much common interest that we can pursue. And being able to unite folks who share our values and our interests, I think continues to be important. And if we're willing to listen to the critics, if we're willing to refine the approach the same way we did with NAFTA 2.0, I think that that's an important point of departure. Ultimately, the United States needs to be in that game. Ultimately, most of those countries welcome our partnership, if not our leadership.
So thank you. And I'm going to tie two more questions together. One has to do with carbon border tax adjustment, and another one has to do with Europe. I'm going to tie it together this way. The Europeans have said they won't do trade agreements with countries that aren't parties to the Paris Climate Accord. You've already said that you hope that if President Biden's elected, he would rejoin that. I think there's a large expectation that that would happen. How do you see trade relations with the EU if there's a new administration? They have traditionally been our closest allies and share our values for the most part. Do you see a greater cooperation and working together with the EU? And separately and sort of related and sort of not, the issue of a carbon border tax adjustment, which is getting a lot of discussion in Europe.
Well, absolutely. I mean, the European Union ought to be the area of trade agreement, negotiation, and progress that is the easiest. Our European allies have environmental and labor standards in many respects that are stronger than ours. There aren't those conflicts. Well, with this administration, there have been challenges, but basically, in the main, this is not any area that's where there's incompatibility. It's in the best interests of American citizens, American business, and with the EU. I would anticipate that we will continue working with them closely. The conversations I've had with our European partners are very encouraging. They're kind of mystified and perplexed about where the United States is and how it got to that point. Of course, we've also seen some of them be mystified and perplexed by Brexit. So there are areas of confusion all the way around. But absolutely, the European Union is such a huge bloc. It is sophisticated. It's environmentally sensitive. They are strong in areas that we want to be able to show partnership and progress. And I think it's a great opportunity.
Great. Thank you. Sorry.
I don't know about agricultural subsidies.
Maybe that's where our values can diverge a little.
We all have limitations.
And we all have, and almost every congressional district except maybe Midtown Manhattan has some agricultural constituencies.
Okay,
in most
in Midtown Manhattan, there's an agricultural constituency. In all seriousness, that's one of the reasons why I'm optimistic to make some progress dealing in the agricultural sector, which, as you know, with developing countries, it's been important, but the United States, Japan, many European countries are some of the biggest offenders. This is an area where Americans are increasingly sophisticated. They care about sustainable agriculture. They don't want to subsidize a diet that makes Americans sick. And vast sectors of the American agricultural community is deeply concerned about regenerative agriculture and being able to refine federal support in ways that aren't trade distorting, but actually are good, for example, for the environment and meeting the nutritional needs of Americans. I think there's a real opportunity.
So let me pivot back to our favorite topic of the day, China. A lot of those agricultural tariffs are, there's still a lot of tit for tat tariffs in place from both sides. What do you think that if President Biden comes into office, should he do something with those tariffs? Should he leave them in place? And what kind of concessions should he extract to help bring those down?
Absolutely. There should be a complete reappraisal. I said a little while ago that I thought everything that Trump administration set out to do was a disaster. The notion that somehow tariffs are going to be paid by the Chinese and not American business and consumers is false. It's a flat out lie. And there's evidence of the impact that these tariffs have had. After the fact, throwing some subsidy money around to try and mitigate the impact is not what, for example, American agriculture wants. They want to be able to do business. They don't want to be viewed as an unreliable partner globally. the notion that we would impose some of these tariffs in the name of national security against Canada, for heaven's sakes, our oldest and most trusted ally, with whom we are literally joined at the hip, is ludicrous. And I am quite confident that a President Biden would go through a thorough reappraisal. One of the things that is important is to not act unduly precipitously. I mean, that's kind of what we got into. We don't want to confuse people further. We want to be able to do this in a thoughtful and reasonable fashion, find a way to unwind the elements that are the most destructive, give certainty. My Lord, people trying to find out whether or not they qualify for exemptions is like a Rubik's Cube. It's extraordinarily difficult, it's unfortunate, and it's imposed burdens on American business and consumers. So I hope that it's a thoughtful reappraisal and that we straighten it out and do it right.
So we're going to get two more quick questions. One, I'm trying to tie as many of them as we can together. Prospects for GSP renewal, and if there's any talk about a miscellaneous tariff bill still this year for the committee.
I think it's too soon at this point to project. A lot of it depends on what happens in the election. A lot of it depends on how raw feelings are, how long it takes to resolve the election. Is it going to be 2 weeks before we tap it down? What happens in the aftermath of what many of my Democratic colleagues feel blatant hypocrisy, not allowing Merrick Garland even a hearing with almost a year to go and jamming this through. I think time will tell. I hope that those are areas that the subcommittee and the full committee and Congress can work on together in a thoughtful fashion. But part of it's going to be the overhang from the election, the Supreme Court, and just having people really spun up. We have our work cut out for us, which I will just conclude on this point, Ken, is that one of the areas why I think there's opportunities to make progress with a trade agenda that's designed to bring people together rather than divide them, and to realistically, thoughtfully, and patiently look at problems like we did with NAFTA 2.0, is I think it may be one of the few areas that doesn't have to be hyper-partisan, where there are common interests that we have that is in everybody's best interest to pursue.
I love closing on a high note, but I'm going to let you off the hook quite yet, because I got one more that ties it all back together again. And that was the first question that actually came in from Bill Lane, who you may know. And he asked you about Bill's, what's that?
Bill on the call. Hi, Bill.
Bill threw a softball your way. He wanted to ask you about infrastructure again. And that might be one way to tie together both a progressive trade agenda and an agenda that is nonpartisan, is not hyper-partisan. Is that something that you see, hopefully in the next Congress, something that can be front and center for your agenda, and maybe tie that to the trade agenda in some ways? We hosted the Port of Portland on a webinar actually earlier during the COVID season to talk about supply chains. So, ports and infrastructure, ports are part of the infrastructure. And if we're going to get our economy moving again, we need to get our roads and infrastructure rebuilt. Any thoughts on that as we close?
Well, and I appreciate Bill's throwing the softball, and as I appreciated his partnership over the years, trying to thread the needle. Absolutely. I don't think there's anybody in Congress over the last 25 years that has spent more time and energy trying to fashion a nonpartisan, comprehensive, bold infrastructure program. I've traveled the country. We've worked on the tough issues of financing, but not ducking those questions. And I continue to think that rebuilding and renewing America is one of the most critical areas. We're falling apart while we're falling behind. The economy is going to continue to be soft for at least 2 or 3 years. Having an ambitious program to rebuild and renew America in a way that is sustainable, thoughtful, low carbon, and enables local governments to be able to build on their priorities that are consistent with what we're doing. The Biden administration, if it takes office, I'm convinced will be an active partner there. This is something that is the opportunity to put hundreds of thousands of people to work at family wage jobs in every community across the country in a way that doesn't have to be divisive. I have been very excited about working with stakeholder groups on a regular basis in Congress, where people have come together and demonstrated their support for, in many cases, raising taxes and fees on themselves and doing business differently, because they know the stakes are high, and they have found that when we work together cooperatively with a shared vision, what we do on the state and local level can be profound. We need to do that nationally, and it's something that I am absolutely committed to being the partner with anybody who wants to work on it.
Congressman Blumenauer or Reed, we are incredibly grateful for your time. Congressman, I've had the pleasure of knowing you since you came to Congress as well. And I've always thought you one of the most thoughtful leaders that we have in Congress. We're very blessed to have you in the position you're in and bringing your creative and fertile mind to the questions that we face on both our national economic issues, national security issues, trade issues, and all the things that you contribute to. So we're very grateful for your leadership, and thank you for your time today. Arit, thank you for the work of ALI in helping push forward some of these very same issues. Really grateful to all of you. Everyone take care, be well. We hope to see you tomorrow as we launch our Trade and the Environment series, Congressman, looking at how past trade agreements and future trade agreements might be used to address climate change. Thanks very much, everybody. We look forward to seeing you soon. Take care, be well, and everybody out there, wear a mask. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman. Nice talking to you.
Thank you.
Thank you. My pleasure. I look forward to the next conversation.
Thanks, Congressman.
That's good.